Today, we are looking specifically at the engagement tactics to help us start diving deeper into how we actually make sure that cities become better for all, for kids and caregivers. So, this is also to help us see how do we disseminate the frameworks and the different tools that improve the mobility, the transport systems, and make streets safer, the air cleaner, and help caregivers access the necessary services with ease within their neighborhood. So just quickly about the agenda. Today we will spend basically the majority of time with our guest speaker and facilitator, Simon Battisti, based in Tirana, Albania. His team from the Relationship Center, Quendra Maradania in the local language. Sorry if I butchered it, I hope not, has been doing a lot of participatory projects with the city there. And Simon will share with us some of the tactics they have been using in the school street pilot projects. So this will be followed by discussions where you will have a chance to share your experiences around what you are working currently, what challenges you are experiencing in your work or in the cities that you are living, and what are some other ways you can engage kids and caregivers in participatory activities. So just to help frame these conversations today, I wanted to emphasize that caregivers and even young kids can actually be part of the planning and decision-making processes when it comes to creating the better streets and spaces and neighborhoods for them. So borrowing from the Arnstein's ladder of public participation, some of you may be familiar with, these are just some examples of involving caregivers and kids. And I think important thing to mention is that there's no one size fits all how to do it, how to engage them. It really depends on the context and even the situation. So you would definitely want to employ and really involve the caregivers and kids and hone into their needs, such as here on the bottom left is an example from Bogota, where in one of their care neighborhoods, there was a public survey after a tactical urbanism project was implemented, and people, including caregivers, could actually share what they liked or did not like about it. And in the bottom right picture, you see a woman's group testing the BRT vehicle of Trans-Peshawar bus rapid transport system. And based on their feedback, the vehicle design was actually adapted to suit their needs for comfort and safety. So to be able to maneuver strollers or be able to hold onto the bus when they are riding. But less involved tactics still have their place in time. Those are on top, just some examples on this scale, meaning the citizens, including the smallest ones, may be more passive in the planning process. It might be about creating spaces where they can experience something. Like in the top left corner, you see a picture of a car-free day in Shenzhen, where kids and their families can enjoy safe and playful streets. And this basically builds awareness about who the streets are for. It helps actually ingrain those little kids' minds about how the streets can be used. And you can devise playful surveys and games to find out, for example, how kids and caregivers are traveling, or what concerns they have about the spaces or the streets or the public transport systems. So here in the top right is a snippet of initiative that was actually carried on in Jakarta, Indonesia, where kids and women were engaged in a number of activities to help improve their mobility near public transport and in the urban villages. So they did interviews and surveys and organized visioning activities for kids to describe their journey. So this was pretty profound and actually fed into guidelines for decision makers. So this is just like a quick overview of what we are talking about today, but I just wanted to give the space to Simon, who just delved deeper into what he's doing in Tirana and spend the next pretty much hour with you. So I'll invite Simon to take over.
Thank you, Mona. Hi, everyone. It's very nice to be here. Thanks for coming to this. I'm really excited to talk today about how we've been working on some of these issues in Tirana and then really hear from you. So I'm going to present basically an approach to a school street program that has been evolving over the last 2 years. And it's been evolving because we've had the opportunity to really ask ourselves a lot of questions, look at a lot of data, look at a lot of feedback from the public, from local politicians, and sort of constantly work on delivering this program at scale across the city. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those different approaches and sort of end on where we are now. And then we're going to ask you to think as a group together about some of those issues in where you work and live, and then kind of wrap up with sharing those together, and then going back out into our respective places, and hopefully with a lot of inspiration and with a lot of energy, because as we all know very well, this work is not easy, and it's opportunities like these that I hope that all of us who are sort of in this in a professional or even private manner can share and kind of seek some strength and solidarity from each other in what we do. So is my slide changing? Okay, great.
Yes.
Okay, so those of you who are working with or within the Urban 95 program know this content pretty well by now, but it's certainly the beginning of our work in Tirana and the School Streets program, where a big part of obviously the brain development that we'll ever have in our lives happens by the time we're 3, and by the time we're 5, really most of it. And so this is a really effective, we find, message for especially politicians, to say that, hey, anything that you do for a 10-year-old, if you've lost them by the time that they're 10 and you haven't, then it's much less efficient as a way to spend your money, basically. Now, all of that vulnerability in younger bodies and brains is we sort of know how to address it. There's certainly a lot of literature around it. About the past 10 years, we have a lot of literature, a lot of scientific research that is showing us now sort of best practices also of caregiving, and the difference between a thriving child and a merely surviving child later into life often comes down to caregiving practices. So things like utilization of services. A caregiver needs to have solid mental health. Caregivers should be practicing healthy infant feeding. There should be a lot of caregiver infant play, all of these things. But we say, of course, all of us, how are we supposed to do this if the city doesn't enable it? It's very much the city's responsibility to be producing these environments in which these practices can happen. So, kids' health is really so much less a parenting choice, I think, as it is often framed, especially in the media. And I think our role as planners and people working in local governments is to say, hang on now, this is our responsibility, actually. All of these things that are required for thriving childhoods, so much of it comes from the built environment itself and what it affords caregivers in their daily back and forth in their daily habits. So jumping really quickly into the case of Tirana, Tirana is quite unique in the fact that up until 1991, there was no private car ownership was not allowed. And so it makes a really, really extreme case of the swing from a city which was almost entirely one where people biked, walked, and took the bus toward one, now, which is completely overrun by cars in similar ways that most of our cities are today. It's just that in Tirana, it got started a lot later. And what that also means is that a kind of pre-car existence is very much in the living memory of young people also, which is also a very interesting part of the work that we do in the way that we speak to people about the issues here. So what the car does, though, in Tirana, as it does everywhere, is takes up way too much space. It pollutes the air. It's very noisy. In the photo that we see here, it completely hinders the movement of people coming and going from school. We work on school streets, which I'll talk a little bit about shortly, because there's such a crush of people at this one particular place in the on a street. 800 kids or so need to get through one door at one moment in time. And then get out. And it's a unique situation in cities in terms of flux. And when you look at the statistics of where kids get hit by cars most, it's at school. It's within typically a 500-meter radius of school, which makes sense because that's where kids spend most of their time, except home. So again, you have these moments you have these spatial nodes in cities which have a huge number of people, especially kids and young kids, all at once, and these are places also which are really, really full of cars and are exposing kids to all of the harms that come along with cars. In Albania, the street is really a place of danger, statistically as well as emotionally, and the data really bears that out. 44% of road fatalities in the country are pedestrians compared to only 20% in the EU. So it's pedestrians getting hit. That's one thing that's really key here. And then another, big part of this situation is looking at this image. This child should be roaming free, right? We need this child to not be at the edge of the street. We have tons of images like this that we show, that we take in Tirana, and I'm sure that all of you have very familiar scenes where you live and work in places where the street is really dangerous. Caregivers tend to keep their kids immobile for the most part, sitting. And this leads to and begins a kind of a lifestyle and like all kinds of sort of factors that lead into rising obesity in this country. There's also just the air quality statistics here also make that road a place of danger. But in general, we have a severe issue with children's independent mobility, and it starts at a very young age, when parents are already, or caregivers are already, really limiting the ability of their children to roam, especially right outside their door. It becomes habit very quickly. So this is, of course, something that we would prefer, where this child is really just sort of hanging out. And this isn't, at a park or kind of a destination in the city. This is ideally, this is just the street outside of this child's home. When we think about proximity to play space, very young kids who are in need of play and being outside every day, it's very difficult for most caregivers to fit this kind of play into their schedule if they have to get to a park. And in cities which are really totally overbuilt, like Tirana already, with not nearly enough green space, we find that those people who are able to bring their kids to play in an adequate frequency tend to be wealthier. And those who do not, their kids either, if they do play, they play in dangerous situations, or they don't play at all. Like in this case, you know, they are going outside. And then, you know, again, this situation is it's very important to point out that, again, this is by no means this caregiver's fault. This caregiver is doing just the absolute, you know, most sort of logical, rational, sane thing. This is not bad parenting for depriving this child. This is this caregiver reacting to the urban situation that they have found, that they have been given. Now let's shift now toward sort of how do we change this now? How do we get kids access to safe public space, and how do we do it quickly? It's really important, we think, to start thinking differently about how we talk about the importance of the access to this kind of public space, how we communicate those ideas, how we get people experiencing them, and hopefully changing people's minds, but not even necessarily changing people's minds, more just, again, providing safe environments for people who already do these things is also a really important part of this, I think. So this is a public hearing that we held in 2020 at the first School Street pilot that we were working on in Tirana. And it was a fairly typical public hearing in the sense that, you know, those people who spoke were mainly men with more prominent roles in the neighborhood. They had a certain level of confidence that, you know, allowed them to sort of speak up and be the center of attention in a space like this. There was mainly complaints. Mainly those people were there to complain about their parking being taken away. There were some, you know, people were raising issues, but most of them had to do with their parking being taken away. And you know, it's not coincidental that those typically middle-aged men, car drivers, showed up to speak up. And then, you know, of course, you know, it's really important, and all of us realize this, I'm sure, but the public hearing it's by no means a kind of democratic space in that sense, that no matter how hard you try, you can't force everybody to raise their hand in a way. And so there's a lot of kind of space in this format for voices to get lost. And a big part of that, of course, when we're thinking about young kids, especially imagine toddlers, while a toddler cannot vote, a toddler has just as much right to public space as anyone else does. And so does an infant, and so does the caregiver. And yet those that infant and that toddler are unable to speak. And so we've been thinking a lot in our work about how to engage and bring about the participation of caregivers, people who typically, you know, are sort of left out of these processes, but then also people who are also just pre-verbal, people who aren't going to talk at all, and maybe you know, don't necessarily, you know, have the imagination about, you know, the future of the neighborhood, like don't have this kind of same idea of time scale in the way that they think yet. So all of the things that we rely on for a kind of what we would think of as a kind of responsible level of participation in a public hearing are actually very, very specific to a type of person. So I think all of us need to think very carefully about how we can kind of undo that, or at least supplement it. in ways that are productive. So we moved on from this public hearing model, and we realized that we just needed to bring these pilots about more quickly. So one of the things that we do in the school street is, in a very fundamental way, we're bringing these street spaces into sort of basic life safety compliance. There's a lot of space in the city that are just absolutely too risky for pedestrians whatsoever. And we don't think that we really need to ask people's permission to do this, actually. And that's kind of our approach. We alert the neighborhood that this is going to happen. Of course, all of these projects are approved by the engineering department. They have the signature of the mayor. We present them to the neighborhood via representatives of the neighborhood, and we put up a sign that this is going to happen. And in a way, we think of this as a very fundamental, sort of basic, just sort of street work. And we need this to be fast, and so we really think of bit here as sort of not really up for debate. What we think about is how we want to fill that space, and so once that space is up, once we've painted it white, once we've protected it with bollards, then we essentially open the space up. Or the space is opened up at that point, and then people just kind of come and use the space. And at this point, we really start to ask people about, like, we do a survey at this point. We ask people questions about how comfortable it is to walk there for them. Before and after, we're doing survey. Here, we're also doing more sort of open-ended questions of just sort of like, what would you like to see here? And even this is really like what you see in over and over is that nobody's really at the survey booth. Nobody's really spending very much time writing. Most people are really just being themselves and just kind of doing their thing. And this really happens over and over. And so at some point also, we've sort of kind of gotten to this point now where we don't even do that pop-up painting the ground white portion anymore. We've started to just throw a street party first, like this, and so we close the street for 4 or 5 hours. We bring everyone out, and again, it's the presence of these people, all of them doing what they do, that is really sort of the strongest indication that we can kind of put together for the neighborhood, of a kind of majority consent in a way. The presence of these people, and is for us, it's really it takes us a long way in this conversation about what we should do in a future street transformation project. And again, one of the things that we at all of these events, there's quite a bit of published material. There's a lot of we bring a lot of there's pamphlets. There's a lot of people from our NGO. There's a lot of people from the city, representatives who are sort of standing around and talking to people about what we would like to have happen there, and asking them about what we'd like to have happen there. But for the most part, these stations are quite unused. They're just empty. And I think that that's also kind of part of throwing a great party, and part of kind of rehearsing a future experience of a street is one where people are they're living that future street. They are not imagining it. They are not gathered around a rendering. what color the wall is going to be, or some of the other kind of minutia that we so often get stuck in. Rather, they are living the street, and by living the street, they're also communicating a future stakeholder group, a large and diverse group of stakeholders, who are going to use that street and who are going to enjoy that street and really occupy it and make it useful. And I think that, like, there's no memo that we could write that is more effective than this image. There's no briefing that we could provide the mayor that would be more persuasive than having some of his staff be at this party and tell their friends about it, and have their friends who are parents tell the mayor about it. And, in order to start to shift the mentality about what a street can be. And imagine this street eventually had, I think it was 12 parking places removed. And imagine that there could be, 20 people somewhere on the side, 40 people somewhere on the side, sort of raising their hand and questioning whether or not the parking should really be removed. In this setting, it's unimaginable. In a public hearing, it's easy to imagine that someone can raise their hand and do that. But in this setting, it's so outweighed by the benefits. It's so obvious that it's just no one would dare, I think. And then with events like that, you get feedback like this. This is a friend of mine, texting the next day saying, "Hey, it was a hit. The first question my son asked when he woke up is this going to happen again next year?" And of course, it's super sad when you have to close down one of these parties and everybody has to go home, because everybody wants it every day. These kids want to be able to come back the next day and have the exact same experience. And it's tragic to say we have to close now. But I mean, this kind of feedback is also really, it's really effective, not only for us internally, but this is the kind of feedback that's really effective for local politicians. We believe that it's this kind of information that they're really looking for. In our context, at least, this is the kind of this is the information that people want. So I'm going to, let's see. Okay, so just a little bit. So here's the permanent street then. Okay, so we made a street party. Fast forward about 6 months of construction process, back and forth with the city a lot. We have a permanent school street built out of bricks. And I just wanted to show these a little bit because I think it's really important to realize how simple they are, the materiality of these streets. It's so inexpensive, and the features of them. So again, thinking about what's really important for young kids and their caregivers in spaces like this, it's not much. It's a little bit of change of height. It's very simple platforms. All of these sort of features are incredibly inexpensive to build, incredibly inexpensive to maintain. And one thing that we find in the public realm on the school streets is that they become they're really sort of they're places to kind of administer care, I would say, somehow. It's kind of, it's like it's very much just about doing the duty of caregiving, is enabled by really simple physical features like these. And I think when there's something quite specific about what's required to take care of a toddler in public space, but very much so, it's just a lot of really easy horizontal surfaces and places to set stuff down kind of, hooks to hang stuff on. And I think this is another part of the School Streets program that I'm not really much about, but I think it's really kind of important to call attention to, is that if I were to break it down into kind of two kind of main ideas, it's that these spaces really, they become really, really useful with very, very little. And I think that's really important for all of us as designers and people who are working on public space, because this is also this is communicating the necessity for these kinds of places in the long term. That once the space is brought into being, it's also really important that it functions well, so that sacrifice or that trade-off that has been made in the street space is understood by everyone as having a long-term value. And I think that a lot of that has to do with how they are designed and understood by the public to be inexpensive, while at the same time being extremely useful. I think this is part of the work that is, I think, sort of again a responsibility of all of ours, is that we have the responsibility to be providing these healthy public spaces for caregivers, to be doing that work of caregiving, but we also have a responsibility to make sure that they're inexpensive to maintain. For example, that they're really that they are functional in the long term, and that they are really, really useful to a very broad swath of the public. Everyone who is doing the work of caregiving, of course, is a really broad swath of the public, but just everybody else too. And this is a street that I think is doing that in a successful way. So we're learning a lot from it. And then this is my last slide. I think this is a point that I also just kind of want to make, is that these streets are never done also. And I think that is really important, is that we are creating living spaces that need to host life in the long term, again, in order to really, especially in this moment, where I think in a lot of cities we're all working on sort of shifting the public's mentality about what a street can be for the first time. People are very much being confronted with the idea that maybe a street is not just for cars right now, right? And that is something that is a huge mental shift for a lot of people, especially drivers. And when we ask people to make that shift, we also, we need to prove it. We can't just tell them. And that means that we don't just throw one party or two and then open the street and never come back. We need to make spaces that are really inviting to be sort of taken over by life at any given weekend, And one of the great things about the geometry of a school street and any kind of street transformation like this is that it becomes so much easier to do. It becomes so much easier to make this a place where people can just put up some bunting, a tent, bring some speakers and dance, because and it feels so much better to do it here than it would have in the street prior to this transformation. So I will stop there, but I would really like to leave with this message that I think the day that the street opens is that is day zero somehow. All of the design, all of the participation, all of that is somehow the pre-term of the street. And the day that the street opens, the project is not done. We cannot think of the project as done on the day that it opens, but rather that's the first day that it exists, and that we have to steward it as well over its life, and not us personally, but we need to set up the conditions in which people are empowered and invited to become that life on the street themselves in the long term.
Thank you so much, Simon, for this really inspiring presentation and really inspiring work that you are doing in the city of Tirana. I see a lot of people are active here in the chat, and actually we have maybe like about 5 minutes for a quick, like maybe questions that you could answer. There are some concerns related to basically like convincing the governments and building their political will or bolstering it to make the change. And how do we do it in like historically car-centered cities? I think Tirana, I'm not sure if it was historically car-centered, but I think those initiatives are taking place on streets that are car-ridden. So I think that's an example right there. But how do we do this? How do we work with cities? Can you relate that to your work too?
Yeah, well, so every city comes at a different starting point. Every elected official themselves comes from a different starting point, and all of their staffs as well. So it's a highly specific, it's a case-by-case basis. I believe very much that, you know, so depending on where you find people, depending on where you find your elected officials, is where you start the conversation. In our case in Tirana, we're very lucky that our mayor is very willing to remove parking, for example. He's politically strong enough to have that fight and to be okay with it. On, you know, these are neighborhood scale streets. Again, most school streets were removing between 10 and 25 parking places, which is controversial in itself, but he's willing to do that. So we don't have to start with that conversation. The fundamental conversation that has to be had with elected officials who are starting before that point is that streets don't have to be the way that they are. We have to have this conversation that, first of all, streets can be slow spaces. Just because we've never seen that street be a slow space is a matter of priorities. And we have made we have so far until now, in most places, prioritized the rapid movement of motor vehicles. That's why it's like that. If we shifted that priority toward the safety of kids and walkability, then, or let's say that 90% of people in a neighborhood walked and nobody owned a car, then the street wouldn't look like that. The street would, you know, have much less. So we have to, you know, that's a big conversation to have with people, and it's a long-term one. I also think, now let me make my pitch for school streets. I think very much that school streets are a great way to start this conversation because of first of all, of the scary statistics around kids being hurt and killed near schools. Secondly, about all of the data that we have about the harms of cars on kids from air and noise pollution, but also just the fact that it's where so many kids and caregivers and families really care about school. It's an emotional issue that everybody can relate to. So school streets are a great way to start this conversation. And I think it's not too big of an ask to go to our local elected officials and say, hey, we need to build a slow street in front of every school in the city ASAP. And you can start there, basically, because if you do start there, you know, even if you do 2 pilots, you can start to point to these issues that are being resolved. And it becomes really a persuasive object to be able to point to. So school streets are a big win, and they're a pretty quick win in the larger scheme of shifting elected officials' mentality about transport and the prioritization of streets.
Right. And maybe one more question from Jairo here. Thank you, Jairo, for posting it. So many cities, I think, historically maybe were more walkable, and with time they switched to more like car-centric urban fabric. So Jairo is asking how to hone in basically to this memory of a walkable city to like override these trends of becoming car-centric.
Yeah, that's a great question. I really like to focus it around play. I really like to tap into people's memories of how they played as a kid, because I think it's easier to go to first of all, it's typically a bigger contrast, and also people still walk every day and they don't necessarily play every day. And I think people take walking for granted in ways that they don't take play for granted. So I would suggest talking to people about, how did you play as a child? And then ask them about how their child plays, or a child that they might know. And think through the contrast, think through the difference right there and then together. And it becomes really stark that what is the issue? Typically, it's cars in the road. And that, and the prioritization of them in every way, not just moving, but parking all over the place, parking, without any consequence, typically in most of the places that we live, so that's a really quick way to get to it. And I think that it's a really effective one. And I think that even more importantly, if a street is good to play, then it's a great place to walk. And it's not necessarily the other way around. And so if we need to get kids playing on every bit of street in our cities, in our neighborhoods, then we ought to aim toward playability anyway. And then they'll be a great place to walk.
Right, this is a great angle, and I think everyone can relate. Everyone can be playful even as an adult and relate to that, not just through memory. So, all right, so we are transitioning to our interactive portion, actually discussing in the groups. So how